Hi there, guys. So I wanted to pick up on a crazy article that appeared in The Guardian last week, in which they outlined how the cost of a place in a children's care home has got to a figure of about £320,000 a year now. So let's have a quick look at the article and then I'll give my thoughts on it afterwards. So it says private firms' profits are soaring as prices nearly double in 5 years. So the article, it says the cost of a single place in a residential children's care home in England has nearly doubled in 5 years to an average £320,000 a year, with private firms racking up huge profits as a result of market failure. The £3 billion children's home market, which is increasingly dominated by private firms, some funded by private equity, is dysfunctional and doesn't deliver good value for money or a good service to vulnerable young people. So it says, in the most extreme instances likely to involve children with complex needs who require 24-hour supervision by multiple staff, councils had been charged up to £63,000 a week for a single placement, and that's 3.3 million a year for one child. Absolutely ridiculous. So then the article goes on. It says privately owned care firms ramped up fees above the rate of inflation, with the biggest providers enjoying average annual profit rates of nearly 23% a year, as they took advantage of spiralling demand, insufficient places and staff shortages. And despite the increase in spending, too many of those placements failed to meet individual children's care requirements. And it says unsuitable placements were common. So Gareth Davis, the head of NAO, said, the residential care system for looked after children is currently not delivering value for money, with many children placed in settings that don't meet their needs. And then, of course, that means that the cost of residential care is seen by local authorities as unsustainable. It is also regarded by many top-tier councils as the biggest cause of overspends in children's services and the most substantial threat to their financial viability. The lack of suitable residential care places meant 4 out of 5 councils placed children with complex needs in illegal care facilities, and official figures show the number of children placed in so-called unregistered homes rose from 147 5 years ago to nearly 1,000 now. Shortages of places were exacerbated by high property prices and councils not granting planning permission for new homes because of local resident opposition. Demand for care home places had risen in part because of a decline in the number of foster carers and the closure of inpatient children's mental health services. So let's have a think about what this means then more broadly. And I think the article outlines the issues very well. And clearly, this is the end result. This system that we've got is the end result of a sort of toxic combination of systemic factors that have been brewing for, a good number of years in this country now. So firstly, we've got, obviously the article picked up there, we've got outsourcing and private equity backed services. We were told, back in the 80s or whenever, that introducing the profit motive to public services would, drive innovation, it would create value for money. But, how's that working out? All we've got now is our public services being run by absolutely huge corporations, private equity backed organisations who have got so much sort of economic clout that they can drive up costs while simultaneously presiding over a drop in quality. So, local authorities now, they're held to ransom because they're so desperate for placements and because those large companies have probably killed off or swallowed up smaller competition. So secondly, it also talked in the article there about the reduction in foster carers. And I'd argue that that's most likely to be caused by poor pay and high levels of need. So I've done a previous video on the state of the foster care system. But what you've essentially got is an increase in the level of need of the children entering foster care, an increase in what's being demanded of foster carers, and then a sort of flatlining of the financial rewards for a foster carer. So in my opinion, sadly, you'd need your head testing if you signed up to be a foster carer these days. It is an absolute tragedy, really, for all the reasons that I've mentioned. And then the final point that it touched on in the article there was a lack of specialist mental health support. We've known for years now about the lack of mental health support for both children and adults. And all that happens is that lack of provision, that lack of mental health provision, it just shows up later on when people reach crisis and when they then need more expensive services. So, in this instance, when already vulnerable children are not having their mental health needs met at an early stage, they might stumble on for a little while, but eventually they're going to need, maybe a secure placement or some sort of specific self-harm reduction placement, for example. And that's going to come at massively increased cost later down the line. So who has to meet those costs? Well, the local authority, of course. And so I wanted to bring all these issues together really and talk about what I think's at the heart of this. And these are all features of our underlying economic system. So you can call it what you want, neoliberalism, Thatcherism, the death throes of capitalism. It doesn't matter what you want to call it. What we've effectively created in this country is a zombie economy, and everything that's being described in this article and everything I've talked about here, these are just symptoms of that economic model. And of course, it's the most vulnerable people in our society who feel this failure most sharply. In this instance, it's children in care. But the issues described here, they're replicated up and down our economy. Look at any public service that you care to mention, the prison system, schools, dentistry, the environment, adult social care. The list goes on and on. Everything gets sold off. We sweat the asset in every area of public life. And then later we have to spend exorbitant sums of money fixing massive problems, which could have been dealt with much cheaper at an earlier stage if we just put simple provision in to prevent problems. We need a wholesale change in how our economy is structured. We don't need any more of this tinkering around the edges. And, local authorities are effectively bankrupt due to their statutory obligations. And of course, that then has a knock-on effect, because that means that they can't do any of the sort of nice-to-haves that make people's lives worth living. For example, looking after our parks or, maintaining our public toilets, stuff like that. And all that does is it in turn creates resentment amongst the population, because obviously our council tax goes up by the maximum amount every year, but we get less service for our money. So the whole system is rigged, and it's going to come crashing down at some point. So yeah, it's a very bleak one today, guys. But yeah, thank you for watching. Really appreciate it. See you in the next one.